Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey. This is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. Liam, what's up?
Not too much, dude. Today we're going to be talking about Trudeau and Singh planning electoral reform behind closed doors, division of the UN being accused of employing Hamas collaborators, 3 American soldiers being killed and 34 more injured in the Middle East, and farmers protesting all across Europe. However, if before we get into things, you wouldn't mind subscribing to us on YouTube or giving us a nice rating on Spotify, that would be much appreciated. All right, let's get into it. So first off, we've got Trudeau and Singh planning electoral reform. So as the Liberal NDP Confidence in Supply Agreement, aka coalition, continues to play out, to the dismay of many Canadians, the two parties have added yet another controversial policy into the mix, electoral reform. And they expect to have it rolled out before the next federal vote. The two parties have agreed to explore 3 different options, the first being allowing an expanded 3-day voting period during general elections. The second is allowing voters to cast their ballots at any polling place within their riding. And third, improving the mail-in ballot process with accessibility and maintaining integrity in mind. So question here would be, isn't it odd that this is coming to the forefront of their plans when their polling numbers are crashing?
I mean, here's the thing. Anytime you look at electoral reform, it always seems shady because the people implementing it always feel like they're the ones that are going to benefit the most, right? Like that's kind of the prevailing narrative whenever you see electoral reform. That being said, this was part of Trudeau's campaign in 2015. Mm-hmm. And even if it doesn't make a substantial difference for, the Liberals over the Conservatives, at least he's following through on a campaign promise, which I think he needs a few of these wins right now. So that's positive. But with respect to like what it actually does for the Liberals versus the Conservatives, this is where I see a bit of a gray area, to be honest with you. Like, okay, so you extend it by, 2-3 days. So what happened, like the voting station. So what happens, where's the benefit for the Liberals versus the Conservatives? And I don't really see it. Now, I do see sort of a benefit I do see an opportunity for corruption. I do see an opportunity for more election tampering. I do see that, obviously, with more time. It's also going to cost Canadian taxpayers a lot more money if they have to maintain polling stations for 3 days, especially when it's cost us $600 million last time. What's it going to be, about $1 billion this time? And I mean, obviously that's a guess. I don't know. Then when you look at the mail-in ballot thing, now this one's funny for me. Like I also think this leaves it open to election interference. And the reason I say that is, for example, like a live example, I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but China interfered in our federal elections, right? Now, one of the things that they do is their base, their group of people that will move over from China, they'll have control over this base. And then they'll be like, okay, well, we're doing mail-in ballots for all these people. So they can basically say, hey, like, come to this place and wherever we meet or however we're communicating, and give us all your ballots because we are in charge of who you're voting for. And I don't think that's just Chinese. It's just they're a live example. Yeah. I think you see it across all different sorts of communities that have some sort of narrative they want to push and some sort of party they want to support. So I think that is a bit of a problem when you look at mail-in votes. But again, I don't see how this situation, well, when I say it out loud, I was going to say I don't see how it helps the Liberals more, but I guess you have more immigrants voting for Liberals. So if you actually have to be like objective about it, I guess you could see that. But I mean, we already allow mail-in ballots. So I'm not sure, they weren't very clear on the changes. So I'm not sure that this particularly benefits the NDP or the Liberals. And the last thing, other than cost, is allowing people to cast their ballots at any station. Again, I don't see the benefit for Liberals and NDPs over Conservatives. I just see more opportunity for election interference because how do you stop someone? And I know that there's ways to do this, but it will be challenging to stop people from voting in multiple stations. Again, like I said, it could happen for both sides. One of the things that the guy said, I think Blakey's his name, he said, we'll have, the proper technology to verify individuals, which kind of made it sound like they wanted a digital ID in place by then, which I don't love. That was something in the subtext they sort of picked up. But again, like, I don't see the major benefit that the liberals gain from this versus the Conservatives. I just see elections right now globally facing the most foreign interference. I believe that it appears that way anyway. And we don't have a lot of trust in them. So I'm just not too sure that election reform or electoral reform that allows for these things to get worse is the right move. But that's my take.
So to steelman their point here, what would be the benefit of adding these policies into place? Let's say the only initiative and the only motive here is to make the election process easier or better for us citizens. How does this achieve that, though? Because I don't see, like, have you heard people complaining about the voting process being like, oh, I need this to change for me to be able to vote or make it easier for me? I don't really hear that narrative going around much.
Well, here's something I will say. I think mail-in ballots should be abolished. I don't think we should have those. But with that being the case, I could suggest that it is acceptable to have multiple day voting or a voting weekend. And the reason I say that is because, look, a lot of blue collar workers, white collar, blue collar, whatever it is, have kids, like they can't get there that day. So you have low turnout. And it is a real problem.
What would be the roadblocks to, say, having the election day be either held on a national holiday or actually create one for it? Yeah,
I mean, that's another alternative solution they could do, is they could say, hey, nobody has to go to work, but then how many people are going to go to work anyway? How many people that are working in shift work, how many people will still not get the opportunity? Because, you know, you look at it this way and it's like, how many holidays are people really shut down? Look at the service industry. Yeah. That's non-existent, right? So, and if you have an opportunity to make money, you're going to take it. So I agree with you. All I'm saying is the only one that I see value in really is allowing a couple days for voting. That's it. Because if you do that, you can abolish the mail-in voting, because now you don't give me this, you don't have time, you have multiple days, and you remove the need for people being able to vote at different polling stations because there's a wider window to vote. So for me, that actually, if you put that in, I think that does help the citizens, but that's it.
I could also see, though, on the, say, interference side, having multiple days allows for the opportunity to check in on how you're doing. Okay, second day, we need to start pushing this or that or whatever, do this nefarious action to correct yesterday's numbers of how we are a little bit behind. Or
I agree, totally agree. Like I said, I think all of these things open this whole process up to a lot more interference. I think the whole thing is dangerous, but your question was, how does this help the people? I think that's the only thing it does help. Now, that being said, to your point, what's interesting is if you have live results on the information, imagine you're like, hey, liberals are down 20%. How much more of the liberal base is now going to be motivated, and how many of the conservatives are not going to be motivated to be like, oh, we've already won? So it's this weird thing, right? Like, I mean, for me, what I would suggest is that they hide the results. But how can you do that? You know that Trudeau's going to have his hands on them for sure to see what's going on. And then you have to look at it this way too, where who controls the media? So if it's a 3-day race and the liberals are down, you know they've got a campaign. You know they've got an emergency red button campaign on that last day that they are going to push if they're down. So yeah, I mean, again, it really opens it up to more manipulation for sure. I don't agree with it, but.
And I really hate this narrative. You know, we haven't had much election talk in Canada as to whether it's a very good system or not, or whether there is nefarious actions at play within our elections. I mean, we've known about, say, the foreign interference, but it's kind of a very common topic down in the States, and a lot of people push that on, say, the Republican base for the Trump stuff in 2020. But then also you go back and you look at 2016, every single major Democrat was saying that Trump stole the election. And then you've already got Hillary Clinton put out a video a day or two ago as well, saying that far-right extremists are planning on stealing the next election or whatever. And so there's this idea, though, that gets tossed around, especially in the corporate media, which is questioning the electoral process is dangerous to our democracy, right? And I actually like to think that when they use the term our democracy, they mean it in possessive form, not collective. That it's their democracy, and that this is a threat to it. But to me, it's like our process only works if we are skeptical of not even just the election per se, but our leaders at large, our politicians, no matter what side of the aisle they're on. Democracy doesn't work if you just say, okay, you guys go do your thing and we trust you. Great. It's like, I look at being able to question these things as a net positive, even if I'm not saying I have any hard thoughts on this is exactly happening, but it does raise a little bit of red flags.
Yeah, I mean, in what way does it raise the red flags? The fact that they're doing it, or the fact that you can't question it? Like which aspects to you?
Both. To be able to, that they put something in and then they go, don't question it.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think a lot more stuff should be done via referendum vote.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to something like electoral reform, because that it changes the very foundation of how your democracy works. So I agree. I mean, I think a lot of these things should be up for debate, and you know, it should come down to how the citizens actually feel about it. But you know, I guess if you started there, that would be a good place. But when it comes to this stuff, like, I don't have a substantial issue with how we manage the electoral process in Canada. You know, I really don't. But like I said, I also don't think it needs this reform. So it's, again, like, you look at a lot of this stuff, and whenever I see things like this happen, you always have to wonder why, right? You kind of go, okay, well, if the system's working already, why fix it? Why make the adjustment? And then people like you and I think most people, if they're really digging in and paying attention, they go, well, this actually, your proposed changes just leave it more open to interference. And you are known for already letting different countries interfere in our elections to your benefit. So I agree.
Or maybe not even countries, but say, for instance, very powerful elites within the world. Like, we've seen Klaus Schwab talk about how half of Trudeau's cabinet is young global leaders on the WEF platform. And then you also hear some of the ideas that get tossed around on the World Economic Forum stage. So, like, did you ever see that clip of the guy talking about how in the future, maybe elections won't even be necessary because we can just use AI to predict what people will do?
That was wild.
And so, like, I look at this and that was Klaus himself?
Klaus, yeah, bro.
So you look at that and you go...
Predictive. Fuck you, buddy.
So you go, these are the people that are making the electoral reforms, and then you also see their ideas about elections in general, and you go, I don't know if I trust you guys to be the ones to reform this.
Right. Like,
even if reforms are necessary, or there could be good ones, it's like, I don't know if I trust it to be in your hands.
That's kind of my point. Like, I honestly can't highlight anything specific to say this is only going to benefit the Liberals, and this is why they're doing it, and this is dark and nefarious, and we need to stop this. I can't see that. And usually I'm pretty good at identifying those things. However, I remain highly skeptical.
Yeah.
But the thing is, what could Trudeau do quietly? And they said he's quietly planning this reform. What could he do behind closed doors that we know is going to is going to change the way democracy works in Canada, that is not going to benefit him directly? The answer is nothing. We just can't see what it is yet. We just can't see how they're going to utilize these new tools to their benefit. I believe they will. It's not evident yet.
Do you see any of the things that are currently going on in Europe finding their way over here when it comes to banning opposition parties or cutting their funding? Or, like, do you think that, like, I look at it and I go, I don't know if Canadians would go along with that. They'd probably have a heyday.
Yeah.
But, like, I don't know. Would you see them trying anything like that?
Not really. And the reason is because we don't really have any radicalized parties. We really don't. Like, you'd like, you know, I guess the people could say, what's Maxime Bernier's party, the PPC?
PPC, yeah.
Some people might say he's a bit radical. I don't think he is. I don't really love him as a politician, just because he's been kind of he's been in a few different parties. So to me, what that says is, and not as an individual, but to me, what that says is you're willing to ride the wave that benefits you the most. You don't have a specific set of ideals you're trying to instill or enforce, or whatever word you want to use. So for me, that's kind of my qualm with him. But he's the closest thing anybody could say is radical. And honestly, if you look at it, it's not even remote, not even scratching the surface of radical.
I'd say a few of the left-wing parties are pretty radical.
Right. So, okay. So, but which ones would you say are radical? Because first of all, they're never going to be banned, obviously, when they're the ones that are in charge, right?
Yeah.
And the big things with conservatives and Republicans is, like, that's not the way we do things. We don't ban the opposition. That's not how it's going to work. In the current landscape of Canada, I don't see that being a part of the equation. And then in addition to that, because of, I think our multiculturalism works in our favor here. I think Canada would flip upside down if that kind of thing happened. Yeah. So I think we're okay for now.
Yeah, no, I hope we're on the right track there and thinking that there's not too much that can be done. But I think the takeaway is to remain skeptical rather than supportive of these kind of reforms and policies. But moving on here, so a division of the United Nations has had their funding cut as allegations of staff working with Hamas surface. So the fallout from the United Nations Relief and Works Agency's staffers allegedly participating in the October 7th attack in Israel continues to mount as the lifeline for millions of people in Gaza faces mission-critical funding cuts. Despite the UNRWA's denial of the accusations, the immediate dismissal of the accused staff members raises doubts about their innocence. The wave of funding suspensions started with the US on Friday, right after the investigation was announced. Since then, Canada, Australia, Britain, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Finland have also joined in with America in cutting the UNRWA funding over the last 2 days. So here are some statistics to highlight what these funding cuts mean for the organization. So the UN received $1.17 billion in funding in 2022. And then also due to this incident, 9 countries have cut roughly $660 million in funding, with the US leading the charge at $343 million of that. And then also, if funding levels were to remain the same in 2024, the UNRWA will have their financing reduced to $496.5 million, losing out on 58% of their expected funding. So what are the broader implications for this? Does this also bring into question the UN's validity when they seemingly have terrorists working within their organization?
Yeah, so this is interesting. I did a bit of research on this. At first, my initial thought was like, yeah, pull the funding, right? Immediately, like, fuck these guys. You know, they've got terrorists as a part of their organization. You know, you can't have this. And then when I did a little more research, what I kind of learned about the UNRWA was that they're really one of the only organizations that the Palestinians have to support them. And that's with food, shelter, education, a lot of things, making sure that they're protected and that they're kind of being looked out from a legal perspective. So that the primary goal of the UNRWA is to really just manage the Palestinian refugees. That's all they really do. I know they do some other small things in the Middle East, but the lion's share, that's what it is, right? So when you understand that, you kind of go, oh, God, you know, as much as you want to pull their funding, which I agree with, you go, there needs to be something in place because there's this collective punishment issue that comes into play when you look at, 12 people that participated in this, or 13 or whatever it was, and then you collectively punish 5.7 million Palestinian refugees that depend on this organization, in a sense, right? Don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's shit going on within the organization, but that's kind of how it lays out, right? So then I was thinking, okay, how do you resolve this issue? Because that's kind of the quandary. You go, okay, there needs to be something here, but they've got obviously terrorists within the organization. How do you manage it? So I thought, okay, in the short term, like in the immediate term, there is enough funding in their organization. So they're not going to cease providing aid for Palestinians anytime soon, because there are hundreds of millions, like what you said, 1.17 billion. There are hundreds of millions of dollars available in their organization. In addition to that, you could get bridge funding from the nations that are continuing to support them. So in the short term, this isn't really an immediate problem. It's more of what's the long-term solution. So the way I look at that is one of two ways. Well, one of three, actually, now that I say it out loud. So you replace the leadership within the UNRWA with an international group of people from the donor nations. So you would have people from America, from Canada, from all these places go in there and manage it. And then they've got their job, which is to sort of try to cull or remove the people that are in there so that the organization doesn't operate that way anymore. That would be one way, is to kind of take the reins on it. Again, that's it. This is a short to medium term solution, actually. If not an international group, then what I think you do is you have the UN put a new set of leaders in there, but then that comes with a set of ramifications. So you and I both know the UN's a bit of a mess. So if that's the case, if you go that direction, there has to be some sort of there has to be a set of rules and a set of things that they have to accomplish to be in there. First thing is you have to go through this process of finding out how these people got involved in the organization that were also involved in this Hamas attack. You have to be able to weed out the terrorism in there if you can, because there are 13,000 employees that are Palestinians primarily. So it may be a tough process, but you have to figure it out, because you can't have any terrorism in this organization.
One thing that you need to realize when it comes to Palestinians as well, and this doesn't mean they're deserving of anything that's happening to them or whatever, but it's a very important thing to note that the general Palestinian population, 80% of them supported the October 7th attacks on Israel. So when you look at that 13,000 number that's the number of Palestinians, you're like, we're not talking about potentially 10 to 20, 30 employees within here that are, say, sympathetic to Hamas, but rather you're looking at almost 8,000.
There's a very big difference though between being sympathetic and participating, right? You can understand that there's been a big issue between, look, the organization is there to support Palestinians. It's maybe an unpopular view, but it's real. Like this is, I think, is like the one that a lot of people should consider. If you may support Palestinians and you may support some of the things they did. I don't. I think it's terribly wrong. But the organization itself is there to support the Palestinian refugees, right? But there's a big difference between supporting Palestine and maybe having an issue with Israel, which I could see them based on their history. I could see there being an issue, right? You can see that disparity, but then participating in it is a whole different thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's all I'm saying is, look, the organization is there to support Palestine. That's what this organization is about. Now, if the UN goes and takes it over and they start managing it, I just think there needs to be some severe ramifications for the larger organization of the UN if anything like this happens again. Again, this is short to medium term, right? Because you can't just pull all this aid from 5.7 to 5.9 million people all at once. You're going to have a fucking nightmare. Yep. You're gonna have a really big problem, is kind of what I'm saying. But the longer term solution, in my opinion, whether they go kind of route 1 or 2, is just to abolish the UN. Because it's an organization where they have these peacekeepers that are really just soldiers. They pass all these resolutions which no one pays attention to if they don't want to. Their financial management it's just full of corruption. You know, they've basically been, you know, global hall monitors that no one gives a shit about and doesn't pay attention to, right? So at the end of the day, I don't even feel like their organization should exist, but that is such a long-term solution because you do need something in place to manage these humanitarian crises, right? So just to kind of recap, I would have pulled funding if I was America or Canada, 100%. However, I do see the need for this organization in the short term to exist. If it's going to continue to exist, I think that they've got enough funding currently to operate. And then the one of two solutions are you put an international board in front of it and try to clean things up the best you can. I understand that there's sympathetic Palestinians in the group. I understand that. Or the UN puts one in with severe ramifications. And then at the end of the day, like long term, you put in some other form of humanitarian system that maybe the Middle East manages because it's in the Middle East versus all these Western countries funding it. And then you abolish the UN, which I think is going to happen over the next 10, 20 years anyway, with the East-West divide.
So one thing that because I agree with you definitely in theory, in principle, that the people struggling out of this crisis would need humanitarian support. But then I think there's also needs to be a realistic view of how much of that support is actually going to them. Because remember, everything has to flow through Hamas. It's not like the UN is going there and directly handing out resources to the civilians of Palestine.
Well, that's just Gaza, right? Which Gaza's got 2.3 million Palestinians, 2 million are dependent on the agency, but there's 5.7 million people in total dependent on it. So you're talking about 1/3, just putting it out there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, true. But then, so there's still the aspect of a lot of this stuff ends up getting used and weaponized against, say, Israel. Like, I mean, there's that famous scenario with their water infrastructure. They helped build water pipes, and then Hamas went and digged them all up and took those pipes and turned them into rockets.
Right.
The rocket launchers. So you're like, I see definitely both sides of the struggle, essentially, where you're like, how do you make sure that the people who actually need these resources are getting them without it being weaponized?
And I think that's where I go, you need someone else managing it from the top down. That's my opinion, is that it's probably wrought with corruption, like most things. Let's be realistic. People are getting free money. Of course, people are going to line up and do bad things with it. I'm not surprised at all. But that's why I go, okay, you need an international group, maybe managing it from the top down, or you need the UN to kind of take in the same role. The only reason I say the UN is because they're already associated. It's an internationally trusted board. I say that in air quotes. But then you can actually, there could be much more severe ramifications for any further damage that the group causes. That's why I kind of go, with the UN, right? Because if it's an international group, you know, Canada, America, whatever, what are the ramifications if these people do something again? Where if it's the UN, you really can come down on the UN at that point, right? You can start pulling apart that organization and be like, hey, this is why, because you guys are running this like garbage and this is what's happening. So that's what and don't get me wrong. I agree with your point. There are a number of issues, but my thought is that this new top-down leadership would deal with more than just the Hamas terrorism thing. It would try to deal with everything. It would try to sort of correct course for the organization. Now, that may be pie in the sky thinking. I may be idealistic. So I apologize if that's the way it comes across. It's not really my intention. I'm just looking at the problem and I'm going, this is the problem. Here's the best solution I can provide today, because there needs to be some support for them.
Yeah. And I'm not sitting here saying that I've got the solution to it either. I look at this and just go, it's so insanely complex that to try to throw a solution out there is almost impossible. But I should also note that this isn't just something I see going on with in specific to Palestine or Hamas. We've also seen it throughout the last couple of weeks with all the aid going to Ukraine being misused and the amount of corruption that essentially ends up going on the black market there. Like, that original report that only 30% of weapons were actually making it to the front lines. Everything else was just getting stolen along the way and sold on the black market. And and then to me, I go, okay, well, this seems to be a massive money pit. And yeah, maybe it helps. These things help a little bit on the ground level. But how much also damage are we causing by giving resources to nefarious actors that sees it along the way? And then you go, is it a net positive or is it a net negative? And I don't know whether it's a net positive or negative, but it's like a question I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at every organization and do that, right? You can look at the Canadian government. They collect over $600 billion a year in tax dollars and they piss it away. Yeah. And they just continue digging us more and more into debt. So I would actually say it's a net negative for what they do. And that's at home.
And I think the larger the organization, though, the more centralized and the further away that organization is from the ground level, the more possibility there is for that corruption to occur.
I totally agree. Yeah. I mean, if one of the, it may be a little offshoot, but it's a good example. And I think I've got the numbers right. So someone can fact check me if they want. I believe the amount of money that went into homelessness in California, might have been Los Angeles, but I think it was California, in 2022 or 2023. It was so much money that each individual homeless person, as per their count, could have earned like $140,000. That's how much money went per individual for homelessness in either California or LA. And you look at that and you go, and homelessness got worse. So you go, cool. So what actually happened here was the organization is just full of bureaucracy, and they did whatever they could to keep the money within the organization and not solve the problems. They can continue paying themselves with taxpayer dollars. This shit happens everywhere all the time, right? At least in this case, and this is what I did. I actually was in the same place as you. I go, well, whatever, cut the funding, screw these people. But then I looked at, I actually practically looked at it and went, okay, even if this organization that they say provides education, food, shelter, protection, whatever, even if it only does a small portion of that, what are the ramifications if it's non-existent? And this is why I was like, oh God, okay, we have to find some solution here, because we do know that shelter is a problem there. We do know diseases and healthcare is a problem there. We know food is a problem there. We know that these are real issues for them. If this is the only organization that's managing this, then how do you cut them off? You know what I mean? Because you look at the homelessness thing happening in Los Angeles, right? And you go, well, if we didn't fund that, what would happen to the homeless people? They would be fine. They really would, because the function of the group really does nothing, really. Like, I may be a little off base, but I'm pretty close. Like, it's a 5-10% impact. Whereas down there, if you don't have them, I think you start losing a lot of lives very quickly. And that's why I support it, in a sense.
Yeah. And to the, obviously we're a little off the UN stuff here with the homelessness issue, but a lot of this, especially in that regard, it's not a money issue, because like, a lot of the worst thing you could do for a lot of these people is to give them a massive paycheck. So for instance, the likelihood of homeless people ODing goes up massively after welfare payments, because now they have, now they can, so it's not really just on the progressive side, people would think it's just, oh, they just don't have access to resources. And you're like, I agree, but that those people should have essentially a pathway to the resources. But if you just hand it to them, then shit can go haywire real quickly.
I agree with you. And I think that's a good rule of thumb, like at scale with these types of things. It's not about giving them money. It's about giving them the systems to survive. Yeah. And I guess what I'm saying is there's already a system for homeless people in LA to survive. So I think it's a useless fund where they're just funneling money and it's full of corruption. And I think if you look at the one in Palestine, the UNRWA, I still think it's full of corruption, but I think that they actually do provide systems for people to survive. Without it, I think a lot of people would die and a lot of people would suffer. That's why I'm saying it's like, you need a solution. That's all. That's all.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so more turmoil in the Middle East, with 3 U.S. soldiers being killed and 34 more injured after a drone attack by Iran-backed militant groups. That's just an accusation by the U.S. They haven't actually taken accountability for that or claimed that it was them yet, but 3 American service members were killed and at the U.S. base near the Syrian border in Jordan. This marks the first time American troops have been killed in the Middle East since the Israel-Hamas conflict began, highlighting escalating tensions in the region. President Biden stated that the attack was carried out by radical Iranian-backed militant groups operating in Syria and Iran, calling it, quote, a despicable and wholly unjust attack. He added that the 3 American service members who lost their lives were patriots and that the U.S. will hold those responsible accountable. Despite Biden's statement, no specific group has claimed responsibility for the attack. That being said, a number of Iran-backed terrorist groups, including Houthi rebels and Hezbollah, have launched more than 158 assaults on the U.S. allied forces in a show of solidarity with Hamas in its war with Israel. So what do you think the strategy is here for these groups attacking the U.S. forces, or what do you think they hope to get out of it?
You know, it's interesting. I think this is something they've been planning. You know, obviously, you know, any of these Iranian-backed groups, obviously there's been 158 bombings against U.S. and allied groups outside of Israel from Iranian-backed groups like the Houthi rebels and Hezbollah just since the conflict began on October 7th. So this was their intention. This got through. You know, there's questions being asked like, how did it get through? How did they actually land something here? Because all the other ones, nothing had. They were able to knock them out of the sky. So I think you're going to do some internal figuring out of exactly, you know, what went wrong, because their weapons technology is so much more advanced. I am actually surprised that they were able to penetrate for whatever reason they did. But I think this puts the U.S. in a bit of a precarious situation, right? Because, you know, we accept certain things in these wars that I'm coming to learn as I get older. You know, we're allowing Ukraine to fight a proxy war for the United States against Russia. We're allowing that. We know what's happening. The West is funding. Everybody knows, but we're allowing it. The red line is putting troops on the ground, right? And then you look at the Middle East. You're like, okay, well, we're allowing all these rebel groups that we know are Iran-backed, that are coming from all these different countries, and we don't hold the countries responsible. For some reason, we accept that and we go, it's okay. It's an acceptable part of war that we won't let this turn into a global conflict. You know, you also let Hezbollah attack, you know, from Lebanon. You allow certain things, and I don't really know why. I don't know who draws these lines or what makes this sort of a red line issue. But when you look at American troops being killed, you run into a bit of a problem, right? Because these imaginary lines that I'm talking about, they're made up by politicians, right? They're made up and they just go, okay, we'll accept this, that's fine. And they pitch it how they pitch it in the media, and then it's no big deal. But when American lives are lost, America does one thing. They retaliate disproportionately. That's who they are. So now that three Americans are dead, 34 plus are injured, there's going to be a mess. They're going to do something that's going to be disproportionate. If they do something that is disproportionate, what does that look like? Because the American people are going to demand it. The politicians can no longer say, well, it's okay that proxy wars are happening. Well, it's okay, these rebel groups, we can't really tie it to these people. But now that some Americans are dead, they're going to have to do something wild. And I'm wondering, is this the thing that tips it over? Is this what turns it into a legitimate global conflict?
So it's funny because I agree with the philosophy of, if you hit us, I'll hit you 10 times harder.
Sure.
I agree with that even on an individual level. It's like, if you come and get in my face and shove me and push me or hit me, like, I am going to try to inflict way more damage. I'm not just going to be like, okay, I'm going 1 for 1 on a push.
No, if you come at me, one of us is going to stop moving.
So I agree with that. But then on the opposite side, when it comes to America, I think their foreign policy has been terrible over the last 5 decades, 6 decades even, where it's like they're walking around puffed up thing. And then when somebody pushes them, they're like, oh, what? And it's like, you've been egging it on. You've been eyeballing. You've been sizing up everybody in this bar.
Flirt with that guy's girlfriend.
Flirt with that guy's girlfriend. Yeah. And then you act like all of a sudden that was just unjustified that somebody came up and pushed you.
Right.
And you kind of go, well, you're in their house. Like, I mean, even Iraq has been trying to say to America to get the hell out of there for a while, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm like, I think it's a tough situation to figure out, because I also think too, no half measures, especially on this scale. Like if you're going to do something, you have to do it.
Right.
And I've pointed out that I actually think that that's Israel's mentality with their response to October 7th, which is like, if you're going to injure somebody, make sure make sure they can't harm you back.
Yep.
But then again, I go to the other side where it's like a lot of these countries operate and militant groups operate on guerrilla warfare techniques. And it's like, look what happened in Afghanistan for over 20 years. Look what happened in Vietnam against guerrilla warfare. Typically, conventional militaries can't beat the guerrilla warfare tactics,
right,
even though they're a much smaller, less well-armed, less organized. And that's actually part of their benefit, is because they're more mobile. Their attacks come with a little bit more of a surprise.
And they know the lay of the land.
And they know the lay of the land.
Yeah.
And then you just look at what happened in all of these conflicts. Like what did Afghanistan, what did it achieve? You fought for 20 years, you spent all of this money, and then you had to pull out, left $8 billion of weapons there that are now in the control of the very people you tried to fight.
Exactly.
And they're in power now. Then now they have the country. And you go, look, I'm not saying America shouldn't have pulled out of Afghanistan. I'm saying they shouldn't have
been there in the first place.
And actually, Dan was my buddy was making a good point the other night about, he's just like, these military generals and these contractors, it seems like they're playing a game of just the tip. They're like, if I can get just the tip in there, then I know I'm fucking in there, because like nobody's going to be able to come and pull me out of this. And then now I've got all the funding I need. I can grow my military, and then I can also sell way and more contracts. And so to me, it seems like a lot of the issue just comes down to not letting them engage in the first place, and then going like, all right, we really need to, because as soon as you engage in that kind of warfare or conflicts on that scale, then I'm even of the point where I'm like, now you have to end it. Now you have to make sure you win.
You see, I agree with all that. I think if you look at Afghanistan, it was more of a resource war. It was to fund their military industrial complex, and then just take resources out of Afghanistan.
Opium.
Yeah, that's all it was. It's all it was. So that's fine. It is what it is. Russia did it for X number of years. Then the US did it for 20 years. Like, it's just, that's the game they play. Now China's in there. If anybody doesn't know, China's now in there. They went in and shook hands with Afghans. So, they're in there peacefully, but that's what they're doing. Yep. Right. So anyway, then you look, but if you go back to the Middle East, they can't fight a ground war right now. They can't do it because all these rebel groups are inside other countries. It's too weird a dynamic, because you're not actually fighting a country. You're fighting a rebel group that's dispersed within all these different nations, right? So the bombing was in Jordan. Jordan's an ally. Like they have like a peaceful relationship with the United States. So that base is there, and they're on the same page about it. So it's like, Jordan's not really going to push back. Do they want them there? Probably not. But the U.S. isn't going to go put ground troops in there and start fighting a war in Jordan. That's not going to happen. So then you kind of look, okay, Iraq is trying to get the U.S. military out. So they're not going to go do that either, even if it's a rebel group, because now you have a fight with Iraq. And if they go into Iran, you're looking at a world war. Like, that's why. Yeah. They can't do that. And I would even suggest in Yemen, like, you can't really put ground troops in there, because you're going to have a big pushback from like the legitimate government, because these are all rebel groups. So what's your only solution? Bombing them. The only thing the Americans can do are tactical bombs. It just hit all these different things. It's just, with respect to it being disproportionate, you look at what's happening in the Red Sea and how many times they've bombed Yemen now, and these Houthi rebels, they seem to know exactly where they all are. Sure. I think they bombed them a dozen times or more. But now that this has happened, and no group has taken responsibility, yet someone will, I imagine, they're going to start targeting these people. And I don't think it was the Houthi rebels. So these other rebel groups are going to be inside other nations. And I actually think Yemen might be the safest place that the U.S. could be bombing right now. I feel like they're the least, maybe not least likely, but they're on the lower end of the scale of the countries that are going to push back and cause trouble with the U.S. But if these groups, if they're like, hey, we're in Iran, now what do you do?
Yeah.
If they're like, yeah, we're in Iran, we are actually an Iran rebel group. Here's where we are. Come get me. Now you have a really, really big problem. Or if they're in Iraq, really, really big problem. So I don't know, man. Like, I could see this going very sideways very, very quickly. I don't know, because the U.S. has no choice but to retaliate at this point.
Yeah. And then so that's where, I look at, say, because Iran is the puppet master of everything that's happening
100%.
here. Like they've obviously they're the ones funding Hamas. They're the ones funding the Hezbollah. They're the ones funding the Houthis.
Yeah.
And so you look at this and you go, okay, so what is their motive? Because I don't think they can go toe to toe with the American military.
No chance.
But then you have to go, okay, so what's their incentive here? And I've made this point before, but it seems just more and more every day that this is what they're trying to do, where if they get America to hit them hard enough to the point where all of the people that have come into the Western nations over the last decade or two can start being very aggressive in our homelands and start essentially militarizing these people here and causing essentially social disintegration.
Yeah.
I can't see any other incentive for them to be doing these things other than to destabilize from within on the Western nations.
Okay, so you think this is a longer play where you're going to see, hey, they poke the bear, and then the bear goes on a full attack, and then all of a sudden there's people in that bear's cave.
Yeah.
And they're going to start causing shit with all the little bear cubs.
Let's go to the bar analogy again. It's one of those things where it's like if you're in the bar and everybody's kind of around, they're not paying super close attention, and you're poking the guy next to you in the stomach and nobody can really see it.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden that guy turns around and smacks you right in the face.
Yeah.
You can turn to everybody in the bar and go, look what this guy just did. And then everybody is on your side and starts trying to.
Yeah. I see that. I don't think you're going to have quite the same situation though, because Americans are dead.
Yeah.
I think they're going to go, oh, you killed Americans.
Yeah.
So I think that I think it's like, I'm more.
I don't mean like, I think you're going to have, say, people that were born in America have that opinion, but I don't think the people that have moved to America in the last decade were going to care that much about American soldiers.
Right. I think, well, I'm inclined to agree with you in the sense that it makes sense if you kind of think of this as a tit for tat situation. Iran and generally the Middle East can't really put up a fight against the US if it comes down to it. You need a Russia or a China involved. So what do you do? What's the incentive here? You poke the bear fights back. I do think that makes sense. I mean, this would be the time where I'd start paying attention to all the people crossing the border in the US. I mean, there was that guy from Azerbaijan the other day we were talking about who was the lead of some rebel group who spent 12 years in jail for what he was doing. That guy's there.
And even if you go look at the videos of people that are crossing the states in droves, you do have to ask, where are all the women and children? It's a lot of 20 to 30-year-old men.
It's a lot of able-bodied men,
and you go like, what's happening here?
Yeah. It's a lot. There's a lot.
It doesn't seem like it's families trying to get a better economic life.
It doesn't seem like they're there for a better life. Now, again, I'll be honest with you. I think that at scale, people are good.
Yeah.
But I still think 10 to 20% may be bad in this group.
You know what's crazy is it doesn't even have to be 10 to 20%. There's been lots of literature on how it only takes 3% of a population, or even take it off of, say, a geopolitical scale and into a company. All it takes is to have 3% of people with nefarious actions to essentially topple an authority. So one thing that's been pointed out is more on the psychological level is that a group can't sustain more than 3% of narcissists within it, because those narcissists will start to pit everybody against each other, and they really know how to pull strings and manipulate. And it doesn't take much for destabilization to happen. So again, that's a good point. I want to be clear. I'm not looking at every single person that has moved to the Western world over the last decade and looking at it and going, all of these people are terrible or have nefarious intentions, but also being aware that it only takes an extreme minority to cause massive consequences.
No, you're right. And I think this would be a catalyst to see a lot of those people mobilize. You know what I mean? They would have a reason. And I think it depends where the bombing happens and what they do. Because if you do end up bombing in one of these countries, like let's say Iraq, well, now anybody that's aligned with Iraq that's in the US they're going to have a chip on their shoulder about it. And anybody that's allied with any Iranian-backed rebel group from wherever they are, depending on the damage caused, you're going to see this mobilization in the US. So yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I don't know where it goes from there, but I could see it causing America a much bigger problem when they do sort of execute that disproportionate retaliation.
So I just did some math here though to find out what that 3% number would be. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the number is essentially 10,000 people coming across the border daily?
Per day right now.
Per day?
That's about it, yeah.
Taking that to a yearly number and then taking 3% of that is 109,200 people.
Oh, that's so many.
So even
that's
if it's just, so even if, so even just,
wild.
yeah. So you're like, that's not a small number of people.
That's 2,000 per state.
Yeah.
That's like obviously a little more, but basically do the dummy math. You got 2,000 people per state, you know, and that's, yeah, I mean, that's a very dangerous situation. I don't know how that plays out for America, but yeah, it's interesting. I think I don't want to get into longer conversation about this, but I do actually think I think we're witnessing the fall of America, and whatever that looks like rather, will look different than the fall of any other nation, because I think they're always unique in their own way. But I think we are sort of witnessing that fall. I don't know how long it takes. I don't know the gradual path. I don't know what the end result looks like, but I do think we're watching it. And I think it's because of things like this. You know, this is definitely a big part of it.
Yeah. And I think it's probably one of those ideas that, you know, even because we've talked about, say, the installation of a global government before.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you can cause enough chaos around the world, you'll even start having the most libertarian-minded people go, this needs to come under control here.
Right.
And then you can kind of say, hey, look, guys, Europe's in complete chaos. Canada's in complete chaos. America's in complete chaos. No one country can fix this global issue. So we need to cede authority to this government or this global body to deal with all of these things.
I don't think, see, that's the thing. I hear that, but okay, explain to me how you feel like 109,000 people from all different walks of life and different cultures that could all potentially be a threat within the United States.
It's not all walks of life or cultures, though. It's most of them are coming from very, very radical countries.
Sure,
to say.
I think you know what? Okay, take ISIS for example. They mobilize people that are Canadian.
Yeah,
they find like people buy into these causes that are young and stupid.
Yep.
It happens all the time. So you can still motivate and change. So all I'm saying is you can't pick them out of a crowd necessarily. You can try, but they could be a lot of people. Once they're integrated into society, how do you even use the apparatus of a global government to get that under control? I don't think you can. I think this is one of those things that now that there are people that have these nefarious intentions in that country, and they are basically a ticking time bomb, there is no way to get that under control. There isn't. How could you possibly? You just have to let it play out and see what the carnage looks like. I hate to say that, but I can't see any reasonable solution to identifying these people and removing them, whether it's a global government or the American government, whether it's Republican or Democratic.
That might be why the people that are supporting these policies are buying bunkers.
Yeah, I mean, there you go.
Like,
yeah, you know what I mean, though? Like,
yeah, no, but chaos can be very useful in that situation. So like in Game of Thrones, I don't know if you ever watched it, the Littlefinger, who is always that guy, like kind of operating in the shadows and manipulating scenarios around him. One of his most famous parts in that movie is he says chaos is a ladder, because it's like, if you know the chaos is about to come and that ladder is about to be shaken,
yeah,
you can just make sure that your own grip is tight enough, and that you know that now everyone that is unaware of the impending chaos or the shaking of the ladder is going to have a loose grip and probably fall off. And then you can look around and go, all right, I'm the only one still left on this ladder.
Right.
And then now you can climb the rung.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, but again, that goes so far down a rabbit hole of like,
for sure.
That's, you know what I mean? But hey, look, I think what we can agree on for sure for now is it's a shame to see these Americans killed, of course. It's very likely that America is going to retaliate with a disproportionate response. And I don't mean disproportionate like unnecessary, but that it is going to be disproportionate.
Yep.
And it's going to be bombing because they can't do ground troops. And then the next step is you may see a mobilization of some sort of terror groups in the United States. Like I think that's a very reasonable like perspective. It's unfortunate, but I think you're right.
Yeah. Well, this kind of actually leads us into our next topic, though, with the security tightening in Paris as farmers aim to siege the capital in protest. So all across Europe at the moment, really, a lot of farmers are starting to push back against these globalist policies. So over the week, specifically in France, farmers have employed tractors to set up roadblocks across the country, creating traffic disruptions while damaging public and government property. They have also orchestrated blockades on major highways, symbolizing their frustration with the current state of agricultural affairs. French farmers are demanding better pay, reduced bureaucracy, and protection against inexpensive imports. Dissatisfied with the government's policies, the farmers are intensifying their efforts to bring attention to their cause. This unrest mirrors broader discontent in European agricultural regions, with the protests extending beyond France, with farmers demonstrating in Germany, Netherlands, Poland, and Romania as well. So do you think these protests are going to spread even outside of Europe and maybe make their way over to North America and other parts of the world as well?
I don't know. It's interesting, right? So I was doing a bit of research on this, and they've been doing these tractor protests for years. This isn't new. I didn't realize that.
On this scale, or?
Like, well, you know, I looked something up the other day and there were tractors in Paris, and this is from a couple of years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, so like this is like they do, maybe not to this scale, but I mean, you also look at any protest, you know, big is gonna, what I'm saying is they utilize these tools. In terms of scale, I don't really know for sure. I don't think you really, you know, I doubt it, because we would have seen something in the media. We've had alternative media and social media for such a long time. But what I mean to say is, this is a tool in their tool belt and they utilize it. And we haven't really seen it scale over to other countries just yet. But will it? I mean, I think it depends on the response they get from government. So far, government's been bending to their will. You know, Germany's been bending, France has been bending. And, you know, now that it's happening in several other countries, I think it will be interesting to watch it play out, because we haven't really taken these tactics yet, but we did do the trucker convoy. And, you know, with the recent sort of legal ramifications that the Liberal government's now under with using the Emergencies Act, that does kind of leave them open to, you know, people mobilizing through tractors or through truckers or whatever to try to accomplish something. But I think you have to ask yourself, like, what are we going to protest here? What's the reason right now?
Well, I mean, those agricultural policies are coming down the pipeline here for sure as well. Like, it's been floated around the government for sure with the nitrogen bans on farming. And then you even look at, say, the carbon taxes and all this kind of stuff that's really negatively affecting the farmers' bottom lines. I could see it reaching that boiling point for sure, where those people start looking at it going, well, I gotta take care of myself.
You might see something here then, but I think one of the things to consider is, if you look over at Europe, all the countries are very close to each other and the population density is much higher, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, when you mobilize a group like this, you can get 100,000, you know, tractors in one space, maybe not that many, but you know what I mean? You can get a substantial number of them in one place very quickly. Whereas in Canada, people have to come from such a far distance that you may see smaller groups of the same thing. And you may see one group that, you know, does mobilize one big thing in maybe the capital or something like this. But I think it plays out different because of the size of our land. That's why I think the trucker convoy was actually so effective, because you could, first of all, they're way bigger, you know. And second of all, you can drive them to your destination with ease. You know what I mean? I know tractors move along, but like, hey, you're not driving your tractor from, you know, Alberta to Ottawa.
It's pretty easy for the police to get ahead of you on the highway, essentially,
you know
and block your access. Yeah.
I think that if it is effective in changing the policy, I believe that you may see something similar happen here. I don't necessarily know if it'll be to that scale or if it'll just be tractors, but it seems like this is an effective way of getting their attention, and it's been working for Europe. And, you know, so I think if we need to do something like that, we will. I mean, but here's the thing. Do you think Canadians have it in them to continue to push back?
Yeah. Well, you know, touching on the trucker stuff there for a second, because I think it's important, you know, we like to throw shade at the Liberal government for that, and that is definitely where most of it should be directed to. But did you see that the Ford government came out this week and said that they still, despite the court ruling, they stand by the use of the Emergencies Act?
No, I didn't see that.
Yeah. So Sylvia Jones said, well, something had to be done, and said that she still stands by. And you go like, come on, like this was just ruled criminal. And yeah. Well,
I mean, I'm not super surprised the government came out and supported their decision, despite what the court said.
Yeah.
That doesn't really blow up. You know, same thing. Chrystia Freeland said, "Well, we don't agree with this, and we're gonna fight this again in court." You know,
but how much did the Ontario government have in regard to, like, say, in enacting the Emergencies Act? Like, were they acting it, or did Trudeau just come along and say, "Hey, we're putting this into place, and here's the powers"?
I thought that it was the federal government, and I thought maybe they were using the provincial government as an apparatus, but I didn't realize the provincial government. That's why I was a little surprised and hadn't heard this. I didn't think the provincial government was really a decision maker here.
Yeah, I don't think they were either. No. So that's why I found it weird that they stood by it, because if you're looking at it from like a political, let's say you're just looking at it as, okay, what's the best political take for me here, would have been if that's the scenario where the Conservative government was just given these powers, just said like, hey, they made the decision in like, yeah, we used them thinking that they made that decision with the proper intentions and the right legal precautions in place. But for them to sit there and say that, yeah, no, that was the right move is weird, especially if it wasn't their decision. I totally agree with you that if it was their decision, they have to try to essentially justify why they did it. But if they didn't do it, it's even stranger that they're saying that.
Yeah, I mean, was this an individual or was it representing the group?
Sylvia Jones. So whoever, I guess she's high up in the federal, provincial government.
What's weird too is it's conservative here, right? So it'd almost be like a great opportunity to push back against the Liberals because you're going to see a blue wave right now in the next election.
Yeah.
So it is a little surprising to me. I'm assuming what they did was just run the numbers on it, and they figured, okay, we have to have some response. Do we want to admit that what we enforced was wrong, or do we want to say what we did was right? And how does that make our base feel? Yeah. I'm assuming that's all it came down to. And I'm guessing that they figure, based on their math and whoever's running their numbers, that was the better move of the two, because there's no way you could mentally you wouldn't make that choice if there were no metrics involved.
Or actually, in here too, there's a little segment in this article where it says the federal government, which invoked the act with enthusiastic support from Premier Doug Ford.
Right.
So if Doug Ford was cheerleading the decision the whole time, then yeah, maybe you have to cover your ass a little bit.
He flip-flops so much, bro.
He's such a loser.
It's wild to me. Like, it's just like I actually think we need conservative governments right now to right the ship. But holy Jesus, what this guy's done is
never thought
terrible.
I'd miss a crackhead.
I know, right?
Anything else you want to go over today, brother?
No, that's it. How about you?
Well, just if you did enjoy today's episode or the podcast at large, don't forget to head over to blendrnews.com and sign up for our newsletter, which goes out 6 days a week. So that's blendrnews.com, BLENDR news.com.
Thanks for listening. Bye, everybody.